In 1835, Charles Darwin was aboard the Beagle when he wrote,
"The natural history of these islands is eminently curious and well deserves attention. Most of the organic productions are aboriginal creations found nowhere else. There is even a difference between the inhabitants of the different islands. The archipelago is a little world within itself, which has derived a few stray colonists and has received the general character of its indigenous productions. Considering the small size of these islands, we feel the more astonished at the number of these aboriginal beings and at their confined range. Seeing every height crowned with its crater and the boundaries of most of the lava streams still distinct, we are led to believe that within a period geologically recent, the unbroken ocean was here spread out. Hence, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhere near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth.
When he wrote those words, Charles Darwin might equally well have been describing not the Galapagos Islands, but the remarkable diversity of unique living species that has evolved only here in Hawaii, like the picture-wing flies and these native plants. Hawaii, the holidaymaker's paradise, is not just one island but several. Honolulu and the beach at Waikiki are on Oahu. Oahu is only one of the pattern of Hawaiian islands. Punched through the ocean floor as volcanoes, they have been produced at known geological times in the isolation of mid-Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. The big island of Hawaii, the youngest, highest and most massive, emerged only 750,000 years ago and is still growing. Before that came Maui, between 1.3 and 1.5 million years ago. Then Molokai. Then Oahu, and oldest of all of these higher islands, with a history of 5.6 million years, Kauai. Kauai may originally have been once as massive as the Big Island, but has since been dwarfed by erosion. This is called the Grand Canyon of the Pacific. Here on Kauai, we know the maximum time available for the evolution of the native species. Species whose ancestors were chance arrivals on the islands, being blown or drifting onto cliffs such as these, and then evolving here in isolation in the middle of the largest ocean in the world. This native species of large fly, and by species we mean here an interbreeding population, is one of some 800 species which has evolved in Hawaii from just one or two immigrant ancestors. The ancestors of these large flies, and this is the largest, were probably as small as the fly you can see to the right. And it's such explosive speciation from such small beginnings that makes these flies and Hawaii so remarkable. The apapani is one of 23 species of honeycreeper that evolved here from a single chance immigration in the past. Common in the ohia forests, the apapani's beak is adapted to sipping nectar from the ohia blossom. The honeycreepers have become adapted to a broad range of diets and lifestyles in Hawaii. Unfortunately, many of these unique birds are endangered or extinct. The o'u, with its finch-like bill, feeds on berries and flowers. The akiapulau hammers on the bark with one part of its bill and extracts grubs with the other. And the crested honeycreeper, like the apapani, sips nectar. Honeycreepers are perhaps a better example of adaptive radiation than the Galapagos finches, whose variations so excited Darwin and strengthened his belief that species could change and evolve into new forms, as he said when he described them.
If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species.
And ever since Darwin, biologists have turned to oceanic islands as evolutionary laboratories, where the process and progress of evolution is perhaps less obscured, though basically similar to that on continents. But the features that make these islands so special, the diversity of new species that evolved here in such a small area, in isolation, and the delicately balanced integrated communities of organisms, also make the islands extraordinarily sensitive to disturbance and disruption, particularly by humans. All too frequently, the future for some products of evolution, like the native Hawaiian owl and the native hawk, seems to lie in preservation in zoos, where conservation of the wild habitat is failing. But what is so special about Hawaii? When the islands are young and still growing, habitats are very unstable. Established organisms are in constant danger of being wiped out, but offspring of the lucky survivors can exploit an enormous diversity of habitats with few competitors. On the big island of Hawaii, the youngest of the islands, the snow-capped slopes of Mauna Loa have, over thousands of years, been constantly dissected by lava flows, some of great area and length reaching many kilometers to the sea. They have built up the volcano flow upon flow, layer upon layer, into one of the largest volcanoes on Earth. Falls of hot ash have also inundated from above, stripping and destroying trees, some of which can nevertheless regenerate from stumps buried in the ash. Nothing stands in the way of the eruptions, not even the progress of man. Yet on the young Big Island, native species such as the ahia can survive these continual catastrophes. In this recent small eruption, the ground split and a curtain of fire spewed out a lake of lava which destroyed the local vegetation. Yet only 5 months later, this completely new environment of freshly cooled lava is being recolonized. Though previous colonists have been withered and destroyed, and though the lava is very porous, this part of Big Island has a climate wet and warm enough to encourage the germination and rapid growth of seeds and spores blown in from nearby. Favorable microclimates at the base of trees, or where the steam vents from the cooling lava below, favor the growth of ferns. Where the heat was less intense, surviving shrubs regenerate. Trees fell where they stood, burned off at the base, but in the moist cavities left behind, other plants now grow. A spider's web now spans the vent from which the lava spouted. There are many habitats and microclimates in this inhospitable terrain. Habitat variations occur on a bigger scale too. Islands of land called kipukas are often cut off by lava flows, old terrain isolated amongst new. And this constant dissection and isolation of habitats has provided one of the main spurs to evolution in Hawaii. Superimposed on these dynamic geological changes is another dynamic factor, the climate. Interaction between climate and terrain has produced, in this small area, a greater diversity of habitat than almost anywhere else on Earth. Anchored in mid-Pacific, these high islands, such as the Big Island, intercept the moist northeast trade winds. Clouds pile up and dump most of their rain on the windward side. Below the alpine dryness at 3,000 meters, there may be an annual rainfall 10 times greater, of 750 centimeters a year. But only 20 kilometers away, on the leeward side, little rain now falls. With only 50 centimeters a year, you see the much sparser vegetation of these drier, almost desert areas. For the erosive effects of the climate, you need to go back in space and time to the older islands, such as Oahu. Here on the windward side, erosion has produced this spectacular coastline, a typical result of high rainfall on friable volcanic rocks. And on Kauai, the oldest island, you see the most spectacular effects of this climate. Windward valleys and waterfalls isolated by savage ridges. So it's the extraordinary variation of climate, combined with the changes wrought by that climate on a terrain that may also be changing through volcanic activity, particularly on the young islands, that has provided the great range of opportunities which chance colonists have exploited, isolated by these valleys and ridges, to evolve the diversity we see today. For the last 1,000 years, and more particularly for the last 200, man has also been exploiting Hawaii for his own needs. Land has been developed for agriculture, crops have been introduced from around the world, and tourists similarly encouraged to come here, bringing with them quite accidentally a host of other new species from all over the world. 25 new species of insects are established every year. And as a consequence, new unnatural pressures are exerted on the true natives of Hawaii. From volcano peaks to the sea, native species are found, but it's often along the coasts that these newest immigrant species make the biggest impact. The white-flowered, pale-leaved candlenut, though the national tree, is an introduced breed which nowadays you can see spreading up the valleys from the coast. It's only away from the city sprawl in the wild back country of the mountains that you'll find the native species in retreat from this challenge. Only in the island interiors do you find the truly native communities.
These plants are native. Their ancestors arrived in the Hawaiian Islands millions of years ago, and they've evolved and adapted to conditions here, so that now you get species like this which are unique to Hawaii. In other words, they're endemic species and they occur nowhere else in the world. Now, the reason you only get endemic species in inaccessible mountain slopes like this is because in the lower areas, the activities of man and introduced animals such as pigs and goats and introduced weeds such as this bramble here have invaded the habitats of the endemic species and virtually wiped them out. In the endemic species extinction stakes, Hawaii has just about the leading place.
The danger is all the greater because the natives can be so restricted in distribution. Species such as the Haleakala silversword is found only on Maui, where it's adapted to alpine extremes of heat, cold and drought, but now is suffering the depredations of feral goats despite valiant attempts at conservation. And this is a relative of the silversword, a distinctly different species restricted to the older island of Kauai, the stately Iliao wilksia. At risk from pigs are the native tree fern forests, and found only at higher elevations the native palm pritchardia. Many of these native plant species have evolved in close association, co-evolved with other native species. Many insects live only on one plant species. The apapani has co-evolved with the ohia. The rapid speciation we see in Hawaii poses problems when identifying and recognizing species.
What I've just caught is a species of insect. It's a fly. In fact, it's a Drosophila species. Now, you may have come across Drosophila, the geneticist friend, before, and feel reasonably familiar with them. But just take a look at this.
This large fly is Drosophila nigribaceus. These big blotches on the wings distinguish it as a male, and it's because of this distinctive patterning that the group of flies to which nigribaceus belongs is called the picture wings. This is the face of the male, and this is what he sees of the face of his mate, not very different to us, but the wing pattern of the female is different, not as heavily blotched. Here are male and female together. But living in exactly the same habitat, and like nigribaceus feeding only on one species of tree, is another related species of picturewing. They live together under apparently identical ecological conditions. The larvae live on the same rotting bark. This second species is called Drosophila wahuensis, only found on Oahu as the name implies. This is a male, and here's its wing pattern, not so different from the female. Though this is the face of the male with two light patches on the forehead. Different if you now compare the female. This species, wahuensis, similarly forms its own interbreeding species population, and though the two species nigribaceus and wahuensis live together, they don't interbreed. This wahuensis male is about to meet a nigribaceus female. Clearly they don't see eye to eye. In the wild, the female will mate only with males showing correct behaviour. So these two species, despite rather similar appearances and apparently identical habitats, do not interbreed. They are distinct biological species. But among plants, there is a problem. The unique native silversword will interbreed with relatives. This silversword, Argyriziphum macrocephalum, and this relative, Dubautia menzizi, both grow close together in alpine deserts and interbreed to produce this intergeneric hybrid. Such interbreeding between plant species descended from one ancestor is quite general in Hawaii, and the problem of where one species starts and another ends is no better expressed than in the ohia, Metrosideros polymorpha. Probably the ancestor of the ohias in the Pacific came from the area of the East Indies, possible because its seeds are small and easily dispersed by wind. And it has evolved to exploit a diversity of habitats on all the islands, from sea level to over 1,000 meters, from wet to dry. And in so doing, the ohia shows a tremendous amount of variation. On recent lava flows and ash, a mature flowering plant is about 25 centimeters high. On older ash cones grow more typical trees with distinctive red aerial roots. Compare the shorter trees of new lava flows with the tall, spindly trees of the older established, wetter forests, distinctive with their umbrella-shaped tops. And look how the hairiness, colour and shapes of leaves vary. You'll even find yellow-flowered ohias. On Kauai, moist air funneled up to the summit by the valleys below make it the wettest place on Earth. 20 meters of rain a year is common, and even here there is an ohia adapted to these wettest of wet conditions growing in the swamps. On ridges in similarly wet conditions you find this smallest of the ohias with its distinct wrinkled leaves and rusty undersides. This variety is so distinctive that sometimes it's classed as a separate species, Metrosideros rugosa. But all of these varieties of ohia can and do interbreed and intergrade within the islands. So, is there one species of ohia or several? Just as you meet this problem in the present, so do you meet it in the past.
Species are the raw material of evolution, and the paleontological record is the raw material for our interpretation of evolution. But how do we decide in that record what is a good species? How do we decide what the limits are on a species? Where one species ends, another begins. We're fortunate that there are animals and plants with hard parts which are preserved in the fossil record. Among those animals which we know best, both in the fossil record and today, are the mollusks, particularly those with shells. We're assuming, of course, that the features that we're using to distinguish among species, the sculpture, the shape, and even color pattern, are genetically determined. That is, that these features are hereditary. But are they? Are these granules genetically determined? Or could they possibly be associated with the environment? Are they environmentally associated? To determine whether or not some characteristics are environmentally associated, we can look at some limpets which occur in brackish water in Hawaii. These limpets live in streams, particularly in the mouths of streams or near the mouths of streams and further up beyond the waterfalls. This limpet comes from the mouth of a stream and is distinguished by its extremely granular or bumpy character. You can see the granules very distinctly on the shell. Upstream, above the waterfall, there are also limpets, very much like the one downstream, and although they look rather like the lower living limpets, they are much narrower and they are very smooth. Do these represent two species, or are they one species, the differences in shape and in sculpture due to the environment? To find out, one student moved some small, smooth limpets from above the waterfall down to the mouth of a stream, and then after several months came back and recaptured his limpets. He found that the limpets which he had moved down had grown, and they had grown a very bumpy lip, distinguishing them from the shell which had grown above the waterfall. Some limpets apparently move by themselves. We can see here a limpet which was just found in the mouth of a stream. Its upper part is quite smooth, the lower part very granular. We think now that these features of the shell are environmentally determined, and when we distinguish between and among species, we have to try to assure ourselves which characters are genetically determined and which are perhaps associated with the environment.
We have seen some of the problems in determining what species are, where one species begins, where another species ends. There are morphological characters, but we have to determine whether or not these characters are genetically determined or are the results of some environmental cause. With the fossils of the past, it's often up to our own best judgment. With the organisms of the present, we can look at additional characters, biochemical, behavioral and chromosomal, to help us determine whether or not we're dealing with good species. These are techniques that Darwin didn't have to help him understand what he saw. Variation that challenged the ancient idea of the stability of species, and later brought him nearer to that great fact, the appearance of new beings on this earth. Species are not immutable, they evolve.